Is there a pattern behind the booms and the busts of the stock market and the economy? And can it be explained by the Bible? This is God's Economic Cycles, Chapter 1. And I'm Alexander Huang, your presenter for today. This presentation was originally given at Ashford Community Church in Houston, Texas on May 25th, 2022. And this presentation is something that God laid very heavily upon my heart because he showed me foreknowledge of financial events that are to come in this year, 2022, and the financial shakings, which will affect many, many households and people around the world. So I'm sharing this in order to try to bring as much awareness as possible before the things occur. All right, let's get started. We're going to be talking about the Shemitah this day. And this topic, the Shemitah, is something that was originally brought to light by Rabbi Jonathan Cahn about 7 years ago, but right now it's very relevant as well. And we're going to go into a little bit more depth about what is happening right now. Okay, let's get started. We're going to begin by going through a couple US market crashes from the 1970s till today. And let's begin with the 1973 OPEC oil crisis. So OPEC, that is the oil producing countries of Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Qatar, and others, they stopped selling crude oil to any countries that helped Israel in the Yom Kippur War because they were enemies. And so that includes nations like the UK and the US. So as a result, because OPEC ceased their exports, oil prices tripled around the world, and the Dow Jones crashed by 45% and did not recover for 20 years. We can see over here in the two photos, we've got gas by appointment only, and here is a standard oil gas station with cars basically wrapped around the place waiting to get gas. Standard Oil, of course, is no longer around. It's been split up because of it was a monopoly. Continuing on to the 1980 stagflation crisis in the United States. This was a terrible situation where inflation in the United States peaked at 14.5%. A third of all savings and loans banks collapsed. The dollar depreciated by 50% against almost every other major currency, including the pound and the yen. US manufacturing jobs declined by 15.6% and never recovered. And so over here, we see people marching in protest about the high prices. Their wages were being eaten up by inflation. And this is the federal funds rate on the right. The federal funds rate is, of course, the overnight interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges for banks to borrow money from them. And we can see that the average, the annual rate actually reached to 19%, which is insane compared to today's interest rates. All right. Moving on to 1987, Black Monday. Trade deficits caused the dollar to depreciate and interest rates to rise. And the Dow Jones fell by 22.6% in one day. And we're already starting to see some similarities. Interest rates rising, the dollar depreciating. This is a common theme among all of these crashes. But we're going to go into a biblical reason why this might be the case. Continuing on, 2001 dot-com crash. The NASDAQ composites fell by 78% and did not recover for 14 years. Obviously, this graph right here is the NASDAQ composite. And as you can see, it crashed by about 3/4. Many online shopping companies went bankrupt. This is the Pets.com puppet. The Pets.com puppet was an ad campaign run by Pets.com, which became sort of the biggest online retailer for pet supplies. They went bankrupt because a lot of these online shopping companies took on a lot of debt. They over leveraged themselves to try to get as big as possible in a short amount of time. All right, finally, let's look at the 2008 Great Recession. Everyone should be familiar with this. A lot of us still have bad memories about this time, but what happened was the subprime crisis, a lot of people were taking on inordinate amounts of debt that they could not actually repay. And when people started defaulting, as the interest rates went up, there was a catastrophic failure in the financial system. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped by 777 points, or 7% in one day. Those of us who are students of Bible prophecy know that God's calling card is the number 7. When you see this many sevens all stacked up together in one place, you can bet that God has something to do with what's happening. The S&P 500 declined by 46%. A lot of people's retirements were wiped out by nearly half or more. Household net worth dropped by 17%. In the United States, 14 million people went on food stamps. The GDP in the US fell by 4.3%. Home prices fell by an average of a third. 3.7 million homes were foreclosed. So in short, a lot of people lost their homes. They lost their jobs. They lost their savings, and they ended up out on the streets. Over here, we've got 2 pictures. On the left, we have job seekers. So many people lost their jobs. They're looking for a new job. Over here on the right, we have a gentleman who has unfortunately lost his home, and he's out here living in a tent in the snow. Is there a pattern behind these crashes? Okay, so we have 1973, 1980, 1987, 2001, 2008. If you'll take a look, they all happen in a pattern of 7 years. And it's something that has not escaped the purview of financial professionals in the world. So let's just take a look at this headline. The global economy has the 7-year itch. And we have a quote from Ruchir Sharma, head of emerging markets and global macro at Morgan Stanley Investment Management. Recessions follow expansions like nights follow day. We've experienced a global recession once every 7 or 8 years over the last 50 years. Okay, so this is very peculiar. He says, for the last 50 years, with alarming consistency, there has been a global recession every 7 years. Okay, again, the number 7. Let's continue. This is a report by the Federal Reserve of the United States, and it says 7-year cycle driven largely by monetary policy. From the bear market in 1966 to the financial crisis in 2008, there has remarkably been a significant upheaval every 7 years. However, the most important common thread among these events is not the interval between them, but rather the stance of monetary policy preceding them. Okay, so according to the Fed, they say, yes, it happens every 7 years and has done so with alarming consistency over the last 50 years, but it's not really about the timing. It's about the monetary policy. Well, as we're going to see, it's about both. So let's explain this from a biblical perspective. All of these crashes mentioned above happened on something that the Bible calls the Sabbath year or the Shemitah. Now, what is the Sabbath year? So the Sabbath year, according to the Bible, is a year of rest, and it comes every 7 years. And it's also called the Shemitah. In Hebrew, this means the year of release. Now, release from what exactly? It means release from debts. So there's 5 rules that the Bible gives about the Shemitah. Number 1, no working for a year. Everybody is to cease from all economic activity. Number 2, debts are forgiven. Number 3, servants are released. Number 4, God unleashes a triple harvest. And number 5, the nation gathers together to learn about God. Let's go into each one of these rules of the Sabbath year. So here we are in Leviticus 25. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year, there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Okay, so the Sabbath is, we're obviously all familiar with the Sabbath given in the 10 Commandments. It's the 3rd commandment, thou shalt observe the holy Sabbath, the 7th day, and rest on that day. But God is saying that it's not every 7 days only. There's a rest that happens every 7 years as well, a total cessation from economic activity. Second rule is forgiving debts. And it says, at the end of every 7 years, that's the Sabbath year, you shall grant a release or Shemitah of debts. And this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. So in other words, if you owe anybody money or they owe you money, all of those debts need to be canceled. This is God's way of deleveraging a society, because there is a tendency for economies to run crazy and rampant with leverage, with debt, especially if we are not in a gold-backed currency system as we currently are, but it's a floating currency system. And so there's basically no reason for central banks not to print ridiculous amounts of money and for people to get into ridiculous amounts of debt. God knew this from the beginning, and he instituted a rule, this sort of check, to basically deleverage the economy once every 7 years. Continuing on, rule number 3, releasing servants. If your brother, a Hebrew man or Hebrew woman, is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year, you shall let him go free from you. And when you send him away free from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. You shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. From what the Lord your God has blessed you with, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. All right, so we see in ancient Israel, it was a common thing. If you didn't have any money, if you had become super poor, you would sell yourself as a servant into some wealthy benefactor's house. And so God is basically here saying that if somebody is sold to you as an indentured servant or slave, you have to release that Hebrew brother or sister after 7 years. So there's a normalization of relationships between not only creditor and debtor, but also between master and servant. And God's saying, not only do you let them go, you bless them with what you have. And so there's people are relating to each other more as brothers or as equals rather than master and servant. God has this normalization of relations in mind in this Sabbath year. Rule number 4, the triple blessing. If you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce? Then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. Okay, so basically, God is saying, I'm allowing you or enabling you to take this rest or cessation from economic activity in the 7th year, because I'm going to bless you so much in the 6th year, you won't have to work for the next year or even one after. So in summary, the Sabbath year comes every 7 years. It's called the Shemitah. It's the year of release from debts. There's no working for a year. Debts are forgiven. Servants are released. God unleashes a triple harvest, and the nation gathers together to learn about God. We're going to go into this last portion a little bit more at the end, okay? So this begs the question, of course, if the Shemitah is such a good thing, why do bad things happen on it? I mean, as far as I know, an economic crash or a stock market crash that wipes out people's retirements, people's savings and their homes, people lose their jobs, end up on the street, that's a bad thing. So why do such bad things happen? Let's find out. So the basic principle we must keep in mind, the Shemitah has a curse and a blessing attached to it. When the nation obeys God's laws, Shemitah is a blessing. When the nation breaks God's laws, Shemitah becomes a curse. Here's the blessing laid out in Leviticus 25. If you keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and perform them, then I will give you the rain in its season. The land shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. So God is saying, if you observe my Sabbath, if you do as I say, I'm going to bless you economically. See, this one, ancient Israel was an agrarian society. So when it talks about rain in its season and produce in the land and fruit of the field, he's talking economic blessings upon the land. So that's number 1, blessing number 1, economically. Number 2, I will give you peace in the land. You shall lie down and none will make you afraid. I will rid the land of evil beasts and the sword will not go through your land. So this is the second blessing, is peace in the land, safety. Number 3, you will chase your enemies and they shall fall by the sword before you. So God is saying, I will bless your military. We've got economic blessings, peace upon the land, and blessing the military. Number For I will look upon you favorably and make you fruitful, multiply and confirm my covenant with you. You shall eat the old harvest, clear out the old because of the new. I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. So number 4, and the most significant blessing, is that God's presence would be among the nation. All right. But what's the curse? The flip side, if you don't obey me and do not observe all these commandments, if you despise my statutes, or your soul abhors my judgments, so that you do not perform all my commandments, but break my covenant, I also will do this to you. I will appoint terror over you, wasting disease and fever, which shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart. And you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. Okay, so we have disease, plagues, and as well, the economy is cursed. Their seed will be sown in vain. They shall not reap. All right. So the economy is cursed, and there's disease. I will set my face against you, and you shall be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you shall reign over you, and you shall flee when no one pursues you. Now the military is cursed as well. So they will suffer military defeat. Right now in year 2022, as the United States has just suffered a military defeat in Afghanistan, I can't help but think that this reminds me of our current situation. Continuing, and after all this, if you do not obey me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. I will bring the land to desolation, and your enemies who dwell in it will be astonished at it. I will scatter you among the nations and draw out a sword after you. Your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate and you are in your enemy's land. Then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. Okay. So God is really giving the principle of the reason why the people would have to be chased away from the land is ultimately because they did not allow the land to enjoy its rest that it was ordained to receive from God. Okay. And we'll see how this played out in ancient Israel. What happened to Judah? Well, rather Judah, actually. So here it is in Jeremiah 34 about an event that happened during the Shemitah year. King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people who were at Jerusalem to proclaim liberty to them, that every man should set free his male and female slave, a Hebrew man or woman, that no one should keep a Jewish brother in bondage. But afterward, they changed their minds and made the male and female slaves return, whom they had set free, and brought them into subjection as male and female slaves. So here we see King Zedekiah had tried, perhaps half-heartedly, double-mindedly, to observe the year of releasing the servants, but he sort of all of a sudden decided, no, let's bring them back. So let's see what God did in response. Therefore, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, you recently turned and did what was right in my sight, every man proclaiming liberty to his neighbor, and you made a covenant before me in the house, which is called by my name. Notice the verbiage that God uses here, proclaiming liberty to his neighbor. It's the exact same verbiage that Jesus uses in Luke 4, quoting Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach freedom to the captives. So when it talks about that in Luke 4 and Isaiah 61, it's actually a direct reference to the year of release, Shemitah, that was laid out in Leviticus 25. But let's continue with the word of the Lord to Jeremiah. Then you turned around and profaned my name, and every one of you brought back his male and female slaves, whom you had set at liberty at their pleasure, and brought them back into subjection to be your male and female slaves. Therefore, thus says the Lord, you have not obeyed me in proclaiming liberty, every one to his brother and every one to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim liberty to you, says the Lord, to the sword, to pestilence, and to famine, and I will deliver you to trouble among all the kingdoms of the earth. Therefore, he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, that's Nebuchadnezzar, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, on the aged or the weak, and he gave them all into his hand. Those who escaped from the sword, he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. So that's like Daniel. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. So here we have the actual reason that God gives in 2 Chronicles 36. Why did he take Judah captive? It was specifically for profaning the Sabbath, the idolatry, the murder, the blackmail, the fornication, all that was bad. But what really set God over the edge was profaning the Sabbath. In summary, the blessing of God had become a curse upon an ungodly nation. Judah was taken captive because of dishonoring the Shemitah. They served 70 years in captivity, 1 year for each Shemitah that was profaned. Judah was taken captive on the Shemitah. Judah was also released on the Shemitah 70 years later. Now, could America also be under judgment? That's some food for thought. Continuing, when, you ask, might be the next Shemitah? Okay, this is all very well and good, but when's the next one? Well, we're in it right now. It's 2022. Okay, so 2008, if you add 7, that's 2015. Add 7 again, we're in 2022. Okay, so you might ask, okay, well, we went from 1973 to 2022, but there was a couple years that we missed in between. For instance, 1990, 1994 or 2015. How come we didn't mention those? And it seemed like, maybe not much happened during those years. Well, there were slight economic pauses or recessions during that time, but they weren't as catastrophic as the other years. We're going to get into why 2022 is going to be one of those catastrophic years. And it really comes down to, we not only have the Shemitah, but we have several key economic indicators here in the United States that are all aligning at the same time to let us know that we can expect a terrible recession or a terrible market crash to occur. First off, here we have the consumer sentiment as gathered by the University of Michigan. And this is a measure about US consumers' confidence in the long-term prospects of the US economy. Okay, so whenever it drops by 20%, you can basically expect a recession to be hot on the heels. And so let's take a look at a couple of these examples. Here in 1980, the consumer sentiment dropped precipitously by 20% within a year, and there was a recession. Here we are in the early 90s, it dropped precipitously and there was a recession. Here in 2001, it dropped, there's a recession. 2008, it dropped, there's a recession. And would you look at that? Here we are in 2022, and there is a precipitous drop in the consumer sentiment again. Okay, meaning there's going to be a recession. Continuing, 10-year bond yields become lower than the 2-year bond yields. This is known as yield curve inversion. So yield curve inversion, basically, when it happens, it basically means that people have lost confidence in the long-term ability of the U.S. government to pay the bonds. It's basically expressing a doubt or lack of confidence in the long-term prospects of the US economy. So whenever it dips below zero, there has historically been a recession hot on the heels. Let's take a look. Here in 1980, you can see that right before that, yield curve inverted. Okay, and over here in the early 90s, yield curve inverted, there's a recession. In 2001, the yield curve inverted, there's a recession. 2008, yield curve inverted, there's the recession. And here we are in 2022, and it's just touching zero, just about to cross over. Okay, so we're in dangerous territory. Next, crude oil doubling in price. Whenever crude oil doubles in price, historically, there has always been a recession. Okay, so over here, we have the crude crisis, the oil crisis of the early 70s, and it tripled, and there's a recession. Okay, here in 1980, it tripled or doubled, and there's a recession. And in 2001, crude doubled, there's a recession. 2008, crude doubled, there's a recession. And would you look at that? Crude has doubled in the year 2022. There's going to be a recession. Next, we're going to take a look at inflation. Whenever inflation is more than 7%, there's a recession that's hot on the heels. So back in the 80s, here we have recession. Here's the inflation reaching over 7%. And here it is, we have a recession over here. And now, once again, here we are in 2022, we're at a 40-year high. Obviously, it looks like way lower than the 1980s, but this chart is saying 5%. However, the way that inflation is actually measured now is different. It's measured based on a different basket of goods in 2022 than it was back in 1980. If you use the same actual way of measuring inflation or consumer price index as was used in the 1980s, you would see that the actual measure of inflation in 2022 is something more like 17%. So we're actually up here. And if we consider how high inflation actually is, there is a recession hot on the heels. And so whenever all these economic indicators, which are very strong predictors of recession or market crashes, whenever they align, especially on a Shemitah year, you can expect that something is about to happen in a catastrophic way in the broader, in the US economy, but in the global financial system as well, okay? So we're not just talking biblically here. Also, economic indicators in the world have started to align and to show that that a recession or a crash is imminent. So let's continue on. What is going to happen to our economy? What exactly can we expect to see? So let's think about what God's principles are in terms of the Shemitah. Okay, there's a cancellation of debts. So he wants to get rid of all of our debt. And how's he going to do it? Let's first take a look at God's attitude towards debt. And here's Deuteronomy 28. It shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord, to observe carefully all his commandments, which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. This is the blessing and the giving of the law of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy. He's just about to pass away. He's about to send Joshua to lead all of the children of Israel into the promised land. And he basically says, here's the list of blessings and the cursings that you might expect from your obedience or disobedience. All these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. And the Lord will make you the head and not the tail. You shall be above only and not be beneath if you heed the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and are careful to observe them. Wow. So from this, it is very clear that it's not God's plan for his people to be borrowers of money. It's God's plan for his people to be lenders of money, right? So he hates debt. It's not the way for his people to live. It wasn't the way for Israel to live, and it's not the way for Christians to live today. And it's clear that God sees debt as a curse and not a blessing. All right, so we can conclude God's plan for the Shemitah is, number one, get rid of all debt in the economy. Let everybody be released. Remember, it's a year of release. Be released from debt burdens. And finally, everyone forgive each other. Now, we might do this the easy way or the hard way, all right? So what's the easy way? Easy way is if we voluntarily forgive one another's debt burdens, if we voluntarily cancel one another's debts. That's the easy way. What's the hard way? The hard way is if God mandates or institutes a forced reset, a forced debt reset. Now, what might that forced reset look like? Let's take a look and use our logic. Let's use our economic intuition, and let's use some common sense to figure out what that might look like. All right. Number one, step one, central banks print a bunch of money to make the economy look good. All right, so here is M1, which is the supply of the most liquid money in the American financial system. This is a number of dollars. All right, so we see here that over the course of time, the number of dollars available in M1 has basically 5x'd from $4 trillion to $20 trillion. Okay, so in other words, there's about 5 times as many American dollars, US dollars circulating in the past several years, I guess maybe like 4 years. There's about 5 times as many dollars circulating as there were previously. And even if we talk about M2, the number of dollars is up roughly about like, I don't know, something like 30%. So in other words, the US the Federal Reserve has printed a bunch of money in a very short amount of time. Okay. Whenever we see the governments print a bunch of money in a very short amount of time, we know that each value of each individual dollar is going to decrease. That's called inflation. And we're going to get into that. Okay. So number one, central banks print a bunch of money to make the economy look good. Number two, because there's so much money available at such low interest rates, people, companies, and governments borrow a bunch of money. Okay. Because they figure, oh, the interest rate is so low. Let's just take out a mortgage. Let's take out a huge corporate loan, etc. Right? So governments feel the same way. So here is the federal debt of the United States with total public debt as a percent of gross domestic product. And so here are the GDP, the debt to GDP ratio of the United States has crossed over 120%. And this is a historic high. Really. And so we see that the amount of money that the federal government in the United States owes is more than the entire GDP, the economic production of the entire nation in a whole year. Okay, so we owe more money than we make. And it's at 120% of the GDP. So this is a historically high level. And it's not just the federal government, though, but it's also people, companies, and local governments. So here we have the total debt of all sectors in the United States economy, including households, including nonprofits, and we see that it is at a historic high. All right, so we have an unprecedented amount of debt floating around our economic system, and it's not just the United States. Let's be really honest, it's not just the United States, it's also Europe, it's also Asia. They all instituted this sort of quantitative easing scheme after the 2008 financial crisis. And so they've all been printing a huge amount of money all over the world. Now, what happens next? Now, these people, companies, and governments, they have so much money in their pocket because they took out such huge loans. They buy a lot of everything, causing bubbles. Okay, so here is the US Case-Shiller National Home Price Index. And we see that there was a peak over here in about 2006 to 2007 in the home price index. That was a time of infamous time of a housing bubble. And obviously there was a crash afterwards. But right now here in 2022, it's even higher and significantly more so. So we can clearly see that the price of homes in the United States is at a historic high. It's higher than even the peak of the mid-2000s bubble. And of course, it's not just the US, it's China, it's Europe, it's all over the world. Okay, here's just the housing bubble, but we also have a concurrent stock bubble. Here's the S&P 500, and as we can see, right before the recent downturn, that was hitting historic highs. Okay, so we've got a concurrent stock bubble, housing bubble, and bond bubble. What's the next step? Currencies begin to lose their value because there's too much of it. And this is inflation, of course. We're seeing year-over-year inflation rates in the United States hit 8%, and with no signs of slowing down, really. And once again, if we measure it the same way it was measured 40 years ago, it'd be more like 15 to 17%. Continuing. What happens when there's inflation? People start to not be able to afford the fundamentals. They can't feed their families. Here's a bunch of headlines that I just dug up only a couple of days ago. Inflation and rising foods leave U.S. families skipping simple pleasures. Parents reveal struggles of raising kids during inflation surge. Inflation remained near a 40-year high in April. Americans can't afford gas and housing as inflation rises. Okay, now that inflation is wreaking havoc on the economy, what's next? Central banks raise rates to try to stop the inflation monster they created. And by the way, we are here. Fed raises rates by 0.5%, the biggest hike in 2 decades to fight inflation. Okay. Now, of course, what happens when everybody has taken on this unreasonable debt burden and the interest rates start to increase? Rising interest rates cause payments on debt to become unsustainable. All right, supposing I am a company, I took out a $10 million loan, and at a 1% interest rate, this $10 million line of credit is, I can pay the interest on it. It's something that I can afford. But if that 1% interest suddenly rises to 4%, 5%, my yearly interest payment has increased by 4x or 5 times in a very short amount of time, and I can't afford it anymore. And so therefore, people, companies, and governments go bankrupt. We're talking about local governments, but we're also talking about sovereign entities. Back in 2008, Greece and other related sort of weaker EU economies really had a really tough time. They almost went bankrupt, if not actually went going bankrupt. Okay, so here is a headline from 2010: hard times lead to dramatic rise in bankruptcies. Now, what might happen in the housing market? Massive foreclosures flood the housing market with supply crashing prices. If a lot of people go bankrupt and they can't pay the mortgage, the banks repossess the homes, and then the homes immediately go on auction. And so what originally was a seller's market, there was anyone seeking to buy homes here in 2022 would know that in the last maybe 2 years in the United States, home prices have risen by maybe 30% in a year. And obviously this has happened because of a shortage of homes. There has been a severe supply deficit. However, when the foreclosures start ripping through the nation, that supply deficit turns into a supply surplus. And now it has turned from a seller's market into a buyer's market, right? Because now there's way more sellers than there are buyers. Okay, here's back in 2008, foreclosures went up a record 81% in a single year, and it continued to go up in 2009. All right, so, okay. Obviously, housing prices crashed by 1/3 in the United States. You can expect something similar to happen this year, not just in the United States, but globally as well. Continuing, financial firms, investment banks and funds that cannot collect on debtors who are bankrupt, they also go bankrupt. Okay, so that's what happened to Lehman Brothers back in 2008. They held a bunch of mortgage-backed securities. Now, all these mortgage-backed securities, because all the people who had the mortgages, they couldn't pay their mortgages, so the mortgage-backed securities became basically worthless, right? Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, but it's not just Lehman Brothers, but it was everybody who was upstream of Lehman Brothers, anybody who had lent money to Lehman Brothers, right? So there was a widespread ramifications in the entire financial market. So back in 2008, we had Merrill Lynch, AIG, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, Royal Bank of Scotland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They all came close to bankruptcy, and they required government bailouts just to survive, right? So on and so forth, up the debt ladder, and global financial catastrophe ensues, debts successfully canceled. This is what happened 14 years ago, and we can expect a similar thing to happen in 2022. Now, the next question obviously is, when's it going to happen, right? When's it going to happen? How long must we wait for this impending doom to occur? Okay, let's find out when it happens according to the Bible. Deuteronomy 31, Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of release, Shemitah, at the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. So this is the nation gathering together to learn about God, to hear about God, and this is the culmination of the entire year of release, and it happens at the Feast of Tabernacles. And we're going to find out more as well here in the book of Joel, we actually find out a revelation about when the economic catastrophe occurs. The word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Petuel. Hear this, you elders, and give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your days, or even in the days of your fathers? Tell your children about it. Let your children tell their children and their children another generation. What the chewing locusts left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. What the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten. Okay, so once again, ancient Israel or ancient Judah was an agrarian society. And so when it says chewing locust and the swarming locust and the consuming locust consuming all of their grain, we're actually talking about a famine and an economic catastrophe. So in other words, Joel chapter 1 is telling us about an economic catastrophe of such grand proportions that it only takes place once every 5 generations. All right. And when does this occur? It tells us in Joel chapter 2, blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is at hand. So we see that the economic catastrophe of Joel chapter 1 happens at a period of time that is marked by the blowing of the trumpet. Now, when does this trumpet blow? It tells us in Leviticus chapter 25, you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, and the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement, or Yom Kippur. You shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. All right, so we see that the day of the atonement or Yom Kippur is when the trumpet sounds. Therefore, the judgment begins near the end of the Shemitah. This is between the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, and the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. The Jewish people call this time the days of awe, or the high holy days, or in Hebrew, the Yamim Noraim. It's a time of repentance and returning to God for obvious reason, because God's basically like, if you don't repent, all of these horrible judgments are coming upon you. So what does it mean for us here living in the Gregorian calendar, though? Basically, the days of awe or the high holy days, people might know that the Jewish calendar, as reckoned by the Pharisees over the last 2,000 years, has been a lunar calendar where it's based upon the cycles of the moon. And the first of the month is the new moon, and the 15th of the month is the full moon. Okay, and so the way it aligns with the Gregorian calendar is different every single year, but for the most part, when it talks about the high holy days, that's talking about maybe about mid to late September. All right, so we can expect for the crash to really come into its full velocity around that time. And that's why I'm predicting a Q4 crash in 2022, and obviously it starts at that time, but it doesn't end at that time. It might take a couple months for the entire thing to unravel and to play out. All right. So let's continue on. We've got a bonus section ahead. We're going to be talking about some deeper spiritual topics about the Sabbath year. But first off, let's touch on some of next week's topics. What happened 50 years ago to bring a curse upon America? How can the curse be broken over our nation? And what will happen to us once the curse is broken? All right, that's what we're going to be covering in the next presentation. But let's go and talk about some deeper things spiritually. All right, why does God take the Sabbath and the Shemitah so seriously? God obviously takes the Sabbath so seriously. It's number 3 out of the 10 commandments. All right, the Sabbath and the tithe, of course, are 2 topics that we in the Gentile church tend to try to say like, oh, it's just something from the law. It's just something from the Old Testament. We don't have to abide by it anymore. But obviously, God takes it so seriously and so personally that that all these judgments might come upon a nation just because they profaned the Sabbath. So why? Let's take a look at what the word Shemitah actually means. Okay. Here's the word Shemitah in Hebrew. Here's the 4 letters in Hebrew, and these little dots right here are the vowels, and these are the consonants. We've got Shin, Mem, Tet, and Hey. Shemitah, right? And it means the letting drop, the remittance, and the release. It's the noun form of the verb shamat, to let drop, to remit, and to release. Shemitah means the forgiving of sins, okay? So let's take a look at this word remittance. It's another translation for the year of release is the year of remittance. Where else have we seen that word remittance before? It's here in Matthew 26. He took the cup, Jesus, before he died, he took the cup, gave thanks, gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." All right, so we see that the Sabbath or the Shemitah is really a symbol. It's symbolic and it's foreshadowing the remission of sins that comes through the blood of Jesus. Next, forgiving of debts, right? We said that's rule number 2 of the Shemitah. All debts must be forgiven. Where else have we seen this before? The Lord's Prayer. Everybody knows this. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. The verbiage that Jesus uses in this passage right here, Matthew 6, verse 12, in the Lord's Prayer, is exactly a reference to the Shemitah, the year of release. And so we see that the year of release is foreshadowing, and it's prophetically pointing to the forgiveness of sins through Christ Jesus. All right. Next, the word Sabbath. What does Sabbath mean? The word Sabbath in Hebrew is Shabbat, Shin Bet Tav. Okay, and it literally means to cease from work. It's related to the word Shiva, meaning 7, the number 7, or perfection, or covenant. So, for instance, the name Elizabeth, Elisheva, means God, my covenant with God, my covenant with my God. That's what Elisheva means. All right. So Sheva, covenant. Sabbath, therefore, means perfection and covenant. All right. Next, Sabbath represents fellowship with God. All right. Let's remind ourselves, when was Adam created? When was man created? Man was created on the 6th day. All right. And he was created on the 6th day in order to share in the 7th day, which is the Sabbath. Thus, the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. On the 7th day, God ended his work, which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work, which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work, which God had created and made. So man was created on the 6th day in order to live in the 7th in the presence and the fullness and fellowship with God. And the Sabbath represents freedom from slavery. And here is the original commandment of the Sabbath in the giving of the 10 commandments. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. All right, so God is making it clear here that now that you're free, you are not to behave in the same way as a slave, because a slave must work every single day. But now that you're free, you must take a day off to demonstrate and to lean in and to basically live out that freedom. And finally, this is the deepest topic of all. Sabbath represents the millennial reign. 2 Peter 3 verse 8 tells us, "But beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day." And Isaiah 46 verse 10, "I declare the end from the beginning." The word for beginning here is merashit. "And from ancient times, things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." Okay, so the word merashit is the same word for the Hebrew name of the book of Genesis. the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So this passage really is saying the 7 days of creation are prophetically describing the end of history, and specifically 7,000 years of world history, because each day is as 1,000 years. And this is a view that was shared by the ancient Jews, by even the school of Elijah, and by the early church fathers. Let's take a look at them. So the ancient Jewish sect of the Essenes believed that human history was formed out of 4 ages. Now, in the time of Jesus, there was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There was actually a third sect called the Essenes. They lived out in the desert near where John the Baptist started preaching, near Qumran. They were the preservers of the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so circumstantial evidence sort of points to the idea that John the Baptist might have been discipled by them, by the Essenes, and a lot of Jesus' earlier followers were from the sect of the Essenes. They believed in 4 ages, from 0 to 2000, and these are the years since creation, was the age of chaos. From 2000 to 4000 was the age of Torah, the law. 4,000 to 6,000 is the age of grace under Messiah, and 6,000 to 7,000 is the millennial reign of Messiah, Jesus. Now, the school of Elijah the prophet, also had a prophetical school, and most of the teachings are completely lost to history, but a couple of them were saved and preserved in the Talmud, which are basically the writings of the Pharisees. Of course, I don't recommend anybody read the Talmud. It's full of, very blasphemous things, but there are some interesting jewels in here. So the school of Elijah taught 6,000 years is the duration of the world. 2,000 are characterized by chaos, 2,000 characterized by Torah, 2,000 years are the period of the coming of the Messiah. And we also have the agreement by the early church fathers. Here's Irenaeus. The scriptures say, the scripture says, thus the heaven and the earth were finished and all their adornment, and God brought to a conclusion upon the 6th day the works that he had made, and God rested upon the 7th day from all his works. This is an account of the things formerly created, as also it is a prophecy of what is to come. For the day of the Lord is as 1,000 years. In 6 days created things were completed. It is evident, therefore, they will come to an end at the 6,000th year. Here's Hippolytus. 6,000 years must needs to be accomplished in order that the Sabbath may come, the rest, the holy day on which God rested from all his works. For the Sabbath is the type and emblem of the future kingdom of the saints when they shall reign with Christ, when he shall come from heaven. All right. And Barnabas, the epistle of Barnabas, give heed, children, what this means. He ended in 6 days. He means this, that in 6,000 years, the Lord shall bring all things to an end, for a day with him signifies 1,000 years. And he rested on the 7th day. He means this, when his son shall come and shall abolish the time of the lawless one, and shall judge the ungodly, and shall change the sun and the moon and the stars, then shall he truly rest on the 7th day, the millennial reign. Okay, so all of these sources, the Essenes, the church fathers, and the school of Elijah, they all believed that history comes to a conclusion on the 6,000th year, and there's a millennial reign, 1,000 years of Jesus, and this in total describes 7,000 years of world history. All right, so the last 1,000 years being the reality of what was foreshadowed by the Sabbath. Okay, so in conclusion, to the Lord, Sabbath and Shemitah represents, number 1, forgiveness of debts. Number 2, remission of sins. Number 3, perfection. Number 4, establishing covenant. Number 5, fellowship with God. Number 6, freedom from slavery. And number 7, the millennial reign of Christ. All right, finally, how close are we to the 6,000th year? Okay, so we might be asking ourselves this. According to the Pharisee calendar, we are in year 5782. According to the Essene calendar, we are in year 5947. Okay, so we're not putting any dates on when Jesus is coming back. This is just some food for thought. Okay, and obviously it's getting close. All right. And so that's my presentation for today. Thank you for joining in, and please check out chapter 2. We're going to be talking about what happened 50 years ago to bring a curse upon America, and what can we do to break that curse. All right. Blessings to you. God bless you, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks.